Wonderful to see you. How are you doing today?
I am good. How are you?
Oh, I'm very, very good. And I'm very excited to be chatting to you on today's story time, talking about your academic observations of people, which is a really fun topic, I think, because you get to see so many students come and go, and you've done this for a length of time that I think I think and I hope I'm going to be picking your brain a little bit to see some of the trends you've noticed and hopefully add a little bit of flavor to the market and what we can do to make sure we're making the best use of the awesome talent that you help to provide. But before we dive into the story time, let the audience know a bit about you. Set the scene. What does it mean to be you?
Yeah, sure. So I spend most of my time at the Kellogg School of Management. That's where I'm a professor in our managerial economics and decision sciences group. Bit of a mouthful. And I spend most of my time there. I lead Kellogg's analytical consulting lab, which is super cool. It's super fun. Basically, what I do is I teach students how to do analytics consulting. Sometimes that's very simple analysis. Sometimes it's really deep, like machine learning and AI kinds of stuff. Sort of depends. And I bring in projects from the outside world, real people, real data, real business problems. So that's fun. I also do a little bit of research out of the lab, which is great because I think part of what a university needs to do well is not just teach, but generate knowledge. And so that's where I spend the bulk of my time. I also am the chief analytics officer at a sales software company called Vericent. It's based out of Toronto. So I'm in the Chicago area. That's based out of Toronto. And my role there is really to help infuse data science into sales decision making. So that's sort of the overview of where I spend most of my time these days.
Oh, I love that. And I love the fact that you get to keep your toe in the corporate environment and kind of in that practitioner space, but then also kind of keeping your heart into academic as well. And for you, what sort of benefits and reasons have you chosen to keep life that way as opposed to going kind of solely into one or the other? What does this diversity provide you?
So look, so I'm a professor in a business school, and that means that if I am too sort of out of touch with business, I'm not going to be all that good at my job, of course. But to me, I feel like academia is really my home. As I mentioned before, I love sort of the two things that I get to do in academia. One is the research part of it. So right now I'm doing two actually very different things. I'll just sort of highlight them briefly. One is I am helping really understand what are the factors that can get salespeople to perform their best, whether that's compensation or support or training or
Hmm.
technology or
Hmm.
whatever it is. There are a lot of opinions out there about what people think should be done. There's actually not a ton of great research in the ways that I sort of think about it. So that's one thing I'm doing. The other research that I've got going on right now is super interesting, and not only because I'm a sports fan, but I'm actually working with professional sports teams, American football, the NFL. We're really looking at how they can improve their decision making around player availability and investment in these high stakes decisions. They pay players so much money, how they
Hmm.
can use data and like sort of advanced modeling to better understand how to spend their money and get the most productivity out of the individuals that they put on the field. And that's kind of cool because it goes well
Yeah.
beyond just sports, right? It's all about how
Yeah.
you spend money to build effective teams. And so that's really exciting as well. So that's the research part of what I do. And then,
Mm.
I'll just mention, you asked like why I keep my toe in both. These days, it's really easy to sort of say you're a thought leader and everyone has opinions, and that's cool. That's great. I mean, opinions are important, and I think thought leadership is important. But I think sometimes we forget that like the creation, the generation of knowledge is pretty important, and universities sort of bear that responsibility. So I love being part of that. The teaching part of it is great too, because I love to help people sort of enjoy that, I suppose. And, I've never been one to love teaching skills, but I do love to teach people how to solve problems and how to be a good critical
Mm.
thinker and just how to be smarter, because I think we all benefit from more people who know how to solve hard problems. And so that's what I get
Yeah.
out of teaching. And as I said, with industry, I get to stay close to what actually is happening because if I'm, like I
Mm.
said, if I'm too far removed from that, then I'm just making guesses as to what's important to people as opposed to really helping out.
You know what? It makes so much sense actually that how both of them kind of feed into each other quite organically, where you're out doing the do, and that's going to impact the theory and the thinking, but then also that's going to help you do the practical side of things, as it were. So it makes a lot of sense. And I tell you what, your marketing manager who markets your course must have the easiest time in the world because you've just made that sound so exciting between how to produce top salespeople through to NFL. I think you've hit possibly, at least 60% of the audience possible of things that would have pricked their ears up of interest,
Yeah,
if not far more.
cast your net
Which
wide,
again,
right?
yeah, but that's, when we're talking about people and especially in academia, I think data analytics has got a bad rap previously for being cold and overly sciencey to the point of it being lost from the story of NFL and actually the players being on the field of that actually being impacted by data. So I think instantly by drawing on those comparisons, you make it more accessible because it's more exciting to more people. I don't know if you think that's fair.
Well, look, I think so. It's funny. Those are sort of two different examples, right? I'm working in sales organizations and then pro sports, and they feel very
Mm,
different, of course. But in some ways, it's like, how do you get the most out of people? And it's all about sort of understanding individual behavior and how do you actually make positive change in an organization by drawing on people's strengths. There's a lot of similarity there. But you're right. I mean, look, the sports thing is fun. I'm a sports fan. I love working in that domain and so forth. And in sales, it's so foundational to an organization that you sort of, I'm always shocked in sales how beautifully some organizations have perfect data just sitting there ready to be analyzed and how they still
mm.
aren't using data science to actually drive improvements. That's super weird to me. And I love helping people with that. But at its core, it's really about how do you get the most out of people and put together people in the right ways, just slightly different contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, you mentioned something earlier about it's not necessarily the hard skills that you enjoy teaching, but that passion really comes through with the problem solving. And I hate saying this word, but there's no other word for it at the moment, which is that soft skills element. What would you say when it comes to your students and people in your classes? Which do they actually come out having benefited more from? Is it a case that you run through all the hard skills and the technical pieces of the course, or because you put so much passion into the soft skills, they almost take that away as something that they perhaps previously didn't realize they were going to get from the course?
Yeah. So, okay. So I actually see this in sort of two different ways. So on the one hand, I spend most of my time teaching MBA students, so aspiring
Mm,
business leaders. It's a big part of what I do. Once a year, I get to teach a course in the engineering school at Northwestern, and this is to the aspiring data scientists. And that's really fun because they come in, the MBA students, they have good, solid technical skills. They are, like I said, they've got really good business skills, aspiring
mm,
business leaders. And they need like to understand how the technical stuff works because when they appreciate how it works, they become better business leaders. But where I have found a lot of really interesting stuff to be done and teaching to be done is with those aspiring data scientists whose tech skills are amazing, and then they go on to these jobs where they are appreciated for their tech skills, but then it becomes a matter of tech skills aren't enough to succeed. And that really is where I see a lot of my role. Like I like to think of my role in that context as helping build like that next generation of
mm.
data leaders. And the next generation of data leaders needs to have more than just good technical skills. And I got a lot to say on that, but you started to say something, so I'll let you jump in here.
No, you know what? I think this aligns beautifully what we see day in, day out, actually, because a lot of the time, senior leaders, it isn't a case of their they're hard skills. I mean, when you get to a certain level, everyone's pretty much of a much. But where people really stand out, like you say, is when they have that really strong storytelling. They understand the business value and how to communicate that well. And it is all the things that traditionally, I think, haven't been as well supported in the data and analytics kind of academic side growing up, because it was very, very, very focused on these hard skills. But now that I think there is more of a case in many organizations of seeing that business leader, that chief data officer, that role that we are now seeing in more and more organizations, I think suddenly we're now having to almost backtrack and re-engineer these situations where actually we can kind of supplement these skills.
Yeah, I agree. Can I share with you my one story that like just sort of hit me in the face with this when I was like,
Of
wow, this
course.
is such an important, yeah. So it's sort of actually, I got to go back a little bit. So um, like 15 years ago, something like that, in the US in particular, and I don't know how much it generalizes beyond the US, but in the US, there was a small but disproportionately loud group of people, parents, who were really hesitant to vaccinate their kids. And this is like way pre-COVID, and vaccine
Hmm.
attitudes since COVID have gotten super weird, in my opinion. But this is way before COVID. And you had this group of people who were like, we're not going to vaccinate our kids against things like measles and mumps and rubella and these kinds of things that kids in the US at least need to be vaccinated for before they can enroll in public school. So my wife is a sociologist at Northwestern, wonderful professor. She decided that she wanted to better understand why people didn't want to vaccinate their
Mm.
kids. And so she went out into the field and she did this big study. And, people were thinking she'd find things like the story that vaccines cause autism, not much evidence of that, but there's some correlation there that, gets people nervous and scared and so forth. All sorts of different reasons that people thought as to why parents didn't want to vaccinate their kids. But the one thing that she found most of all was that when you talk to people who are hesitant to vaccinate their kids, that their biggest pushback was just, nobody tells me how to raise my child. Nobody tells me what I have to put in my baby. I know my baby better than anybody else. Nobody else can tell me what to do. Sort of this very sort of independent, rugged individualism. And
Mm.
some people have suggested it's very US specific. I have no idea if that's the case, but whatever, that was sort of what I'd seen. And therefore she'd get really frustrated when public service announcements would try and change people's mind, convince them to vaccinate their kids by just giving them more data. Oh, here's another
Yeah.
study that says how effective it is, right? So fast forward a couple of years after that, I'm leading this analytics workshop, a huge workshop at a pretty well-known financial institution. And I'm about to go on stage and someone, like in front of a couple hundred people, and one of the senior sponsors there, pulls me aside and he says, hey, I'm glad you're here. I'm getting really pissed off at our data team. We need somebody to fix it. I don't know the guy. It's kind of a weird thing to say, but I do know their data team and I think very, very highly of them. So I'm like, well, what's going on? And
Mm.
he says, they hired me to run this project. I'm one of the world's experts in this area. And the data team keeps telling me how to run my project. This is my baby. I know what's best for my baby. And I don't mean to make too much out of this little, semantic
Yeah.
coincidence, if you will, the use of the word baby. But what struck me at the time was, God, people get so emotionally connected to their work. And to the point where they're likening it to their baby. And I know it's just a casual
Yeah.
colloquialism. It's not, literal, but still they talk about it in those terms. And
Hmm.
if we continue to treat data and analysis and insights and models and so forth as we're going to tell people what to do differently, then we're kind of sunk as data professionals, right? Because
Yeah.
we're just going to, because people get emotionally connected, emotionally attached to what they do. And the more senior and more important their work is, the more they tend to be emotionally connected to that. If we just keep doing, what we're doing and say, you got to change what you're doing, my model speaks for itself, this is what you have to go do, we're never going to make change. And really what I want to do is I want to help data scientists and data professionals become really indispensable to a business. And you don't
Yeah.
do that by just building an awesome model and then saying, hey, I'm done, my model speaks for itself. So
Yeah.
that was that moment, like it was like 10 years ago now, something like that, where I was like, God, we can't just focus on the business people. We got to focus on the data professionals being better at some of the stuff that we're talking
Yeah.
about here.
Yeah, and I love that story, and this is why I love this series as well, because I think these stories just bring this to life so fantastically, and it makes me think of another CDO that we have in our community who really dislikes when we talk about the business versus the data team, because really it should be all combined. And I think what your story does so well is it really shows an example of what happens when the data team is sat over here and the business team is sat over here, that if you are just throwing data at a situation, you're just furthering yourselves from that kind of combined relationship that you should have. And that actually it should be that the business and data are one, and you are all viewing this together. And as you say, you want to be indispensable. You want to be that right hand person to the situation. You don't want to be seen as an outsider who doesn't understand the nuances of the business and the journey of the business as well, especially in these legacy companies, or even if you're the first data lead or the first data team on the scene. Business has happened before you, so suddenly you've got to show yourself to be a competitive advantage, because in the minds of quite a few people, if business happened before you, it can probably happen after you too.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, for sure. And you don't want to be in a position where, you're a nice to have, because then you get, cut the minute the budgets are cut. I had sort of an interesting thing the other day. I periodically will talk to alumni, both of the business school and the engineering school. And this happened to be, I brought together some alumni from the engineering school. So these are practicing data scientists. And I lead workshops for data scientists, and exactly this. I lead this thing on collaboration and communication, and I work with data teams. They can be kind of small, they
Mm.
can be big, lots of different domains. And I went to this group of alumni from the program and I said, tell me about some of the biggest challenges that you have. What do you wish you learned in grad school? What do you wish there were training around? Because that just helps me be very much in touch with their world, not just what I think their world might look like. And, a couple of people said something that I hadn't really thought about explicitly. And they said, where I work, we are measured, at least in part, or evaluated at least in part, on the impact that our projects have. And that seems sort of obvious. Okay, of course, right?
Mm.
Everyone gets measured on their impact, but impact has to happen in two different places. On the one hand, you got to get people to buy into the fact that your work is important, and then you also have to do good work. And I think we often, sort of just think of the second part of that. If you do good work, then you have an impact. But with
Mm.
data, you need to make sure that people buy into it, and that when you build your model, when you run your analysis, when you integrate your machine learning or your AI or your simple insights into some sort of workflow, that it is added value, and that they're actually going to pay attention to it and not just sort of dismiss it as the, sort of the geeky way of looking at the problem, but it's actually a value add. So when they mentioned that they get evaluated like that, I was like, yeah, right. You got to get the buy into the project and do good work. And those are two
Mm.
very separate things.
And very challenging things too. And I think sometimes when we talk about this, it seems like, yeah, that's the answer. But actually, getting that buy-in and that cultural understanding can take years. And I think this is also where, from senior leadership, there's quite a lot of pressure. And I know it adds to the turnover of a CDO role, is because it does take a long time to see that value. It's not going to be instant. People aren't going to, hitch themselves to that quickly. They're going to want to see some sort of return of investment. So these things take time. Now, I appreciate that not everyone is going to be able to access an academic program like the one that you run. So do you have any kind of top bits of advice for someone, say someone's watching this interview now and they're thinking, yep, I really need to upskill in these soft skill areas. Other than accessing a program like yours, what are some tips that you'd give them for increasing their skills in this space?
Well, look, I think that, so if you're a data professional, and that can be someone who is a PhD level data scientist, and it certainly doesn't have to be that advanced. I think, look, so as I mentioned, there's some good trainings and workshops out there that aren't like a full-on MBA or aren't a full,
Mm.
master's degree or PhD in data science, right? I mean, they're good training programs. I run them, other people run them. So that might be something that's more accessible to an organization. And one thing I will say, by the way, I think that this area is still new enough that a lot of people who control the purse strings of training programs don't always know what data teams need. So there's always the
Yeah.
opportunity to lobby for more of that, right? I think it's still sort of being developed, and as that generation of data leaders is being built, we're still sort of figuring it out. But for people who don't get the opportunity to do much in the way of formal training, I always think that there are like these four key ways to improve. And I sort of think of them like this. I think that there's the commitment to being a better problem spotter in an organization. So we often think, like in the worst case, when I talk to data folks, they're like, oh, we analyze data for a living. No, not really. And other people who are a little more savvy, maybe a little more senior, will be like, well, what we do is we solve problems. That's
Mm.
better. But I think sometimes we get so sort of focused on, I'm going to solve this one problem, that we forget that when we look at data, we can spot problems across an entire organization. We get a view into an organization through a data lens that sometimes other people don't have. It's wider. We can go deeper if we want. And sometimes we have a unique ability to spot problems.
Mm.
So I encourage people to look beyond the problem that they're given. Um, Problem spotting is important. Problem scoping is really important. And by that, problem scoping, I mean, like when you're working with someone in the business on a problem that they have, it can be hard to sort of frame it in such a way that data will be helpful to it. And sometimes that's nothing more than just more transparency and more interactions and more
Mm-hmm.
questions with the business folks. And I encourage data teams and data professionals to ask a lot of questions, a lot of what if questions, the business. The other two things I'll just briefly mention. So we got the problem spotting. I like talking about the problem scoping, problem shepherding. We never want to like go into isolation while we work on something,
Mm-hmm.
then come out 2 weeks or 2 months later, big reveal, right? We want to be transparent about what we're working on. And that problem shepherding is about getting buy-in. And then a lot,
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about communication, I think of that sort of as that solution translation. Hey, we got some results. How do I translate it into something that the business person needs? So I'm not sure if that's a direct answer to your question about what else can people do, but I like focusing in those four
Yeah.
areas because doing good work in those areas is often doesn't require a lot of training. It might require some practice and so forth, but it's being cognizant of what's helpful to you
Mm.
as a data professional. And if you get more of that buy-in and trust and collaboration with the business team, things tend to go well from there.
Oh no, I love that. I think just like you say, challenging your perspective on that, whether it's problem solving versus problem spotting and kind of thinking about your mindset on that is going to be very transformational. Amazing. And
Yeah,
then
it's
Joel,
empowering too, right? It's
yeah.
empowering for the data folks because that they get to sort of, like I said, see more, and if they feel empowered to bring
Mm.
problems to the surface, I think it's great. Anyway,
Absolutely. Yeah, and my last question to you is, you know, because you have a foot in each camp of the data world, which is quite unique. What excites you the most at the moment? What are you kind of reading loads about and getting kind of excited to bring into both the business world and also the academic world to talk about?
yeah. So a couple of things. I mean, that the notion of team building using analytics, whether it's professional sport or whether it's a non-sport business context, I think is incredibly exciting. It's not just, some people will be like, well, that's like Moneyball, right? Isn't that what they did in Moneyball some years ago? But Moneyball did a lot of prediction around performance, and this is sort of another layer on availability. And when you get combinations of individuals, what contributes to team building? And I think there's going to be a whole new way of building teams, which I think is super cool. I also get kind of like there are a lot of really interesting transformations going on, a lot of talk about some really cool tools. But I got to tell you, one of the things that I get excited about most is when companies like use analytics for very small improvements and they just sort of build it a
Mm,
little bit over time. Because we get so enamored with these totally different workflows and totally different ways of doing
yeah.
business. I kind of get excited when we're like, hey, we built a model that helped us get, 2% better here and 1% better here
Mm,
and a little here. And then within 12 months, you've got a more efficient, more profitable business. Like, I like how those little things build up. In
mm.
some ways, for a lot of companies, they're a little more realistic than the big transformation. So I love that part of it, which I don't know. Some people get excited about, but only after they've looked at the 12 months of improvement. They're like, oh, it turns out this worked really well. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think, again, if we think about the average CDO's kind of tenure, a lot of them do report back that difficulty in short-term wins and long-term goals. And I think you're right that actually, if you can do that iterative work that seems smaller, in the long term it does pay off, but also you can kind of show the business what you're doing as you're doing it. Because I think the
Right.
danger is you go behind the scenes and you work on something like you said earlier, and you end up going, ta-da, look at what I've done for the last 12 months, but you haven't really involved people in that journey as much as you can when you're doing it in small steps.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, when we are building, when we get little successes, sometimes I know people are like, I don't know if I'm going to share that. Like, that was such a small thing that we did. But the thing is, we get to do that a lot, and we can
Mm-hmm.
improve a little bit here and a little bit here and a little bit here. And that is often a good way to justify ourselves in an organization. And that's, I think, a good way to become indispensable, which is, as I told you before, one of my goals is to, where appropriate, make sure that data science really becomes
Yeah.
indispensable to an organization.
Absolutely. Well, Joel, it's been fantastic chatting with you today. Thank you so much for coming on to Data Storytime.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was great. Thank you.